it might be interesting to go all the way back to your own first encounters with museums, because for so many people, school trips or parents or grandparents or whatever, childhood is the time when we first encounter museums. And for some people, it may become a lifelong relationship. For others, that may be all that they experience in museums in their lifetimes. But I do think it's a really formative experience and formative time. You've obviously had a long and evolving. I mean, you're still a young man, but you've had a young. It's been a long. Going back to childhood, it's a long and evolving relationship with museums. So, can you begin today just by taking us all the way back and telling us what museums meant to you, how you experienced, how you felt that? Because museums for you very much a sort of felt experience there. That's absolutely core. So tell us what age you are. Tell us where you are. Tell us who's taking you. Give us some sort of flavour of that initial encounter.
I'm definitely under 10. I would suggest I'm about 6 or 7. And the one of the big highlights for me was going to Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery. And I had the pleasure and privilege of working there later on as an adult. So it gave me a very strange emotional resonance to know that I'd once inhabited that space with wonder and joy. And then I got to go back and experience it with adult social consciousness and working with people and for people. My first and fundamental experience was being lost, both literally and emotionally. I was surrounded by objects that were beautiful and strange and dangerous and boring and curious all in one go, and a strange level of multiplicity that I'd never experienced before. It wasn't just one pot or one vase, it was 10, but curiously devoid of any sensory interaction. I remember them being a series of corridors with cases behind glass. And for me, the most exciting part was knowing that I was going to meet Tyrannosaurus Rex. That was the big exciting point for me. It wasn't a real T Rex, it wasn't a large, enormous series of bones. It was a giant maquette and it was surrounded by other fossils, but it was a T Rex for me. It was incredible and it roared and there was movement and there was foliage and there was life. And I could not get to that space fast enough. I remember repeated visits where when I knew I was getting closer to it, I would start sprinting. I didn't know where I was sprinting to. I didn't know the direction I was going in. I just remember screaming with absolute joy and excitement and tearing past objects that were curious and beautiful, but didn't really have an emotional impact on me because I thought they were things that my nan would like, that my dad
Yeah.
would like. And I was constantly being told to um, slow down by my family, slow down by the staff. The staff were really good natured about it because they knew where I was going and they knew why I was going there. So I was never scolded, but it was always, oh, slow down. Have you seen this? Slow down. Have you seen this? But it was transcendent. It was an escape from everything I knew, everything around me, and everything I was. And it felt like just for a couple of moments, life was paused and I could access it on my terms and in my time.
Yeah. That's really interesting. And I was just thinking as you were talking, if you compare it to another civic building, such as a library, where children, if they're fortunate, also sometimes have kind of quite profound encounters into a different world. What you've described though with the museum is a kind of like a different level of intensity, isn't it? Where the encounter is really intense and not as sort of diffuse as it might be in a library. And that sense of the encounter, but also the emotion that goes into it, is something that is a thread that runs through the book, isn't it? So it's not something, I'm guessing, that you would say we leave behind in childhood and we replace with something more, in inverted commas, sort of grown up. Is something that's kind of intrinsic to the museum experience.
I was operating on pure adrenaline and snacks as well. I remember hula hoops,
Sugar.
hula hoops and pop. But it was an incredible because in operating on such emotion and adrenaline and instinct, and something that made me run without consciously deciding I was going to run in the first place was really eye-opening for me because it wasn't necessarily an intellectual experience that happened afterwards as I was digesting and processing it. And my parents very diligently said, "Oh, have you read that label? Do you know what that word means?" And they would walk me back. It was sensory, it was visceral, it was happening, and it was a place where I could throw large amounts of energy and emotion.
Yeah.
And it was not only appropriate, it was welcomed.
Yeah.
And that was the difference for me for other civic institutions where I was constantly being shushed, I was constantly being herded or told what to do. It was my first experience of genuine autonomy where I got to make decisions about me for me based on emotion and need.
Yeah. And again, you've got that tension that persists that you mentioned there. Your parents sort of saying, "Hang on a minute, have you read the label?" They've got some kind of educational imperative at work there, and that again is something which persists, isn't it? Whether the museum is about education, if it's about this centre of expertise communicating knowledge to the grateful or ungrateful populace, versus the sort of sense of this actual personal encounter with something that is special because here it is in a special building in a special case presented in special lighting. Again, things that we might think of as characteristic of the childhood encounter are things there's a tension there which persists in well into adulthood.
Hugely. And I think one of the incredible things about that encounter was that it was on my terms with something I cared about, and it was a built-up encounter as well. I knew a week in advance we were going to go to the museum. I was so excited. I got to wear my dinosaur t-shirt. There was such complex sociology. It was bound up in my relationship with family. It was bound up with my relationship in terms of travel and movement around the area. It was pride, it was excitement, but I think one of the things that I'm also conscious of is that these spaces are not representative for some people, and that
Yeah.
the early dynamism I experienced gave way to a series of encounters, I think, at school that I found were quite riddled in inertia. It was conversations about other people that I wasn't engaged with. They weren't on my terms. They weren't interesting to me. They weren't emotional. They were positioned, as you say, with such academic and educational rigor. It denied the emotional encounter and the emotional experience of what it was that I was looking for in the first
Yeah.
place. And there was a counterintuitive to that. It's a space that makes, and museums, I would suggest, are spaces that make you feel and think so much, and your heart travels far faster than your head does in terms of these
Yeah.
spaces. But then I was constantly being reminded to stop feeling, to start thinking, to analyze more. It That didn't seem intuitive to me, and I
Yeah.
followed that with other people to places of disempowerment, joy, discrimination, erasure. It's an incredible opportunity to engage with people.
Yeah. So if you've just described there a kind of feeling of estrangement from museum as you get older, thinking, oh well, it's about education or it's about this sort of particular view of the world or our roles and our identities. So what brings you back to it? Because a lot of people, I guess, might go through that initial childhood excitement and then a feeling of this isn't really for me for whatever reason. But you've clearly come back to it in a big way. So tell me about that coming back to it. In what terms and for what reason did you come back to the world of the museum?
Oh, what a beautiful question. Equity, curiosity, and a magnetism that was stronger than a lot of the other emotional things happening around me. And I think I've tried to explore that as well in terms of the book. There's a very curious thread with people that they may have experienced disenfranchisement in these spaces. They might have been negative experiences, neutral experiences, framed as quite boring encounters or encounters that they weren't in control of. But yet, a number of us still keep going back to this. They are such huge moments in our lives, whether we're conscious or unconscious of it. Even if we've never been to a museum, consciously never engaged with a museum, most of us know what one is or has encountered one in pop culture or externally through somebody else. There is a draw, I would suggest, about the unexpected survival. not only that, but also that these spaces are curated to be about our lives, but not living in a strange sense. There's a disassociation there. I think they're spaces in which we can and do have incredibly powerful conversations about ourselves with other people, whether we articulate that out loud or not. And I think drawing back to those spaces for me, one of the things, the curious thing I found about it for me was that these were spaces of solace. If the world was moving too quickly for me, if I needed to process things, if I needed to hold a mirror up against myself or an experience I just had, I would go and sit in a museum or art gallery, very much not necessarily in a sense of spirituality, but very much in a sense of pause, reflect, mindfulness, kind of sit and find myself. And I found myself doing that consciously or unconsciously across my young adult life as I was growing up. They weren't just places to occupy a rainy
Yeah,
afternoon for me. They weren't just a useful toilet stop in a busy town or
mm,
city. It was pause, it was sanctuary. It nourished me in a way that I didn't understand or could articulate
yeah,
until I started doing so on behalf and with other people through my curation. So
yeah,
I was so pulled to the magnetism of these places and the emotion of these places. I didn't understand why until I started doing so with people, for people, and in tune with people.
yeah,
And suddenly it made sense because it was a way for me to articulate care, both to myself and civically, and to ideas and identities that are far greater than me.
yeah. That gives me a really good segue then to my next question, which is if we were in a museum today, how might we encounter you? How would you be presenting yourself? What would you be presenting? What would you be, and what would you actually be doing? So we come into a gallery, and at the other end of the gallery, who do we see?
Oh, you'd hear me before you saw me. I think one of the biggest manifestations of me is tours. I think there's so much work I do with communities, curators, researchers, academics, building ethics, making decisions, pulling ideas together, challenging ideas, seeing what works, supporting people during that process. There's a big iceberg underneath of involvement, both emotionally and academically, thematically, in how spaces are built, how they operate, how we engage with people. The top of the iceberg, the most visible part, is me in a bow tie and a really cool shirt doing a tour. And I think that's one of the interfaces that people find with museums that is often one of the most human, I would suggest, because we're not explaining, we're advocating and we're emoting next to these pieces. And I think what's really curious is that when people encounter me in those situations and perspectives, there's two very different versions of me happening in that space. There's me, the proxy body to the organization and to the pieces. And some people will very much treat me as a spokesperson for what I'm standing next to. If they really love a piece, they will enthuse to me and they'll say, "Oh, congratulations." I'll say, "Oh, thank you, but it wasn't me, but thank you so much." If they hate a piece, they will be very irate with me and they'll be like, "Oh, this drives me mad and I'm so angry and I'm so hurt." And I'm like, "I hear you. Again, I'm not the object, but I can have this conversation with you." I get to be the interface for so many different emotions. My aim and ambition in having tools and engaging with people isn't the conveyance of facts,
Yeah,
it's the realization of emotion and connection within that. I think the label's brilliant. I think to understand, to have greater depth, to have a gatekeeper that will give you that little extra piece of knowledge in a very human way is brilliant and can sometimes make the moment. One of the things I advocate for is that if you're standing in front of a museum exhibition or an art exhibition, you already know everything you need to know, regardless of what's the label, regardless of any detail, because you know in your heart and you know in your head what you like. And I think everything on top of that's a bonus.
yeah. And one of the things, John, which I think came through from our very first conversation about this book, was that answering the question, what are museums for? You really have to answer the question, who are museums for? Because that's really at the heart of it. Because it's your book isn't about, the air conditioning systems or the security systems or, and it's not about assembling national collections and it's not about timelines of art history or whatever. It's about, as we've sort of touched on, it's about the encounter, it's about the emotion, it's about the human connection, and therefore, who the museum is for is absolutely fundamental to that, because it's so easy to, imagine a stereotypical visitor, and in doing that, and imagine their needs and their interests, and in doing that, inadvertently exclude large sections of the population. So, can you talk a little bit about why this question of who the museum is for is so central to addressing the title in the question in your title?
I think the presupposition with museums historically and sometimes in actuality today is presumptive trust, presumptive interest, presumptive welcome, that they purport to be able to tell everybody's story with a level of authority and integrity. But actually, when you start to expose and explore that, they are very good at asking questions, not necessarily at posing answers. And I think how we ask that question, I think, is absolutely central. And with it, the autonomy that we carry within those spaces. So if we reference me, for example, on a tour and I'm all dressed up and you can hear my heels clicking on the marble and I look very museumy, um, that's offset by sometimes I go in and I'm wearing a tracksuit or a hoodie and I'm a bit wet. I'm on my way to the gym, but I just want to
Yeah,
kind of stop by and spend some time with something that I really care about. And most of the time, I'm treated with absolute respect and kindness and welcome, but very occasionally, I'm profiled dressed like that based on how I look. And one time, someone assumed I was trouble or causing trouble because I was sat there in a tracksuit.
yeah,
And it was fascinating because I thought, well, if I come back dressed in professional version of me, I would be treated and afforded huge levels of privilege and treated very, very differently. It was a reminder to me that how we present in these spaces is important and powerful, and there are consequences. And I think finding equity, finding spaces, because these are sites for me of social care and social service. They are a benefit to other people. They function for people. um, Museums without visitors are just elaborate storage. It's they exist to be for people on their terms.
yeah,
And I think how we present in these spaces, I think, is crucial to understanding how we can articulate in these spaces and recognizing that these are, for me, in my opinion, one of the few spaces of social democracy that are really powerful and palpable. And you can come and invest yourself as yourself in these spaces, which should be in equity. I think the really interesting giveaway for me is in a society, in a world that is so noisy and is moving so quickly with so much sensory bombardment, electronically and physically. It's one of the few spaces where you can just sit down and not do anything, and there's no social backlash to that. No one would think it would be strange or suspicious that you're just sitting and thinking in these spaces or just daydreaming. I think that's the magic of these spaces. And I
yeah,
think how we present and how some people have been very welcome in these spaces and arguably some people have been very much excluded from these spaces, I think is the powerful conversation around how they move forward.
yeah. Talking of conversations, you came up with a very clever concept for this book of making each chapter based not just around a theme but around a museum and an object in the museum, but I think critically around a conversation or a series of conversations. So it's not just you going into the museum and giving your impressions or you reading the academic literature and sort of digesting that. You're actually talking to people who are like you on the front line day in daily, dealing with these sorts of questions, working through the practicalities, with these issues in mind. How do you actually organize a museum, show and engage with the people who come through its doors? So tell me a little bit about how you decided um, where to go and who to talk to.
Oh, as subjective as the book title itself, I would suggest. I think one of the things I wanted to root the experience in is truth and vulnerability and transparency. So the opportunity to write this book was the opportunity to meet and go on experiences and go to different places. Not necessarily for the first time because I had a connection with a number of the people and a number of the pieces previously, but with a new agenda, with new eyes, with new experiences. And I think one of the things that museums and people that work in museums do really, really well is that the concept of engaging with in togetherness and warmth. I think there's a real key component in the museum identity there. I wanted the experience to feel like you'd been on a tour with me in a museum, but a museum of amalgam ideas,
Yeah.
not not talking about the pieces because the pieces exist, talking about the pieces because they make us feel and they make us think. And it's another facet of asking the question, which is massively important in balancing the level of equity and privilege that these institutions have, that culture is up here and we are somehow down there. Museums need communities. They need them to exist. They need them to function. And I wanted it to feel like not only they're on a tour with me, but also that they got to sit down with the people that invest so much time, energy, and emotion and creativity in bringing these spaces alive and giving them purpose and equity and kindness themselves. That I wanted to feel like you were sat down having a cup of tea with
Yeah.
us and having a conversation because I think the humanity of that is more useful than the institutional magnitude of what museums are, which is quite daunting. Museums for me are a series of very pointed emotional encounters and a really lovely warm drink afterwards and a chance to talk to somebody that cares about this subject.
Yeah.
So that was my position of how I wanted to build it.
And you give a kind of behind the scenes insight into museums. Maybe not sort of literally in the sort of digging through boxes or, dusty artifacts, but behind the scenes in the sense of the thinking that goes in to the way that museums present themselves and the way that they engage with people, which may not be obvious to the person who's just visiting the gallery space, but you bring home that there's a lot of hard thinking going on about the very question in your title, what museums are for, how they evolve, how they meet needs better, how they address these themes of care and so on. And I think that's the kind of insight that would be very hard to get from any other source.
I think it's there are so few people on the ground footfall that work in museums versus people that visit museums. If you think about the millions of people that go to museums versus a core staff sometimes of 50, 20, 10, one or two that run these institutions and make these decisions. I think one of the things that I'm conscious of is that there is such a privilege in having those conversations, and those conversations are happening every day, both practically and emotionally, to kind of to operate in that space. And I think including as many people as possible, not only in the conversation but also the emotion that goes into that conversation, I think really humanizes places that some people haven't found to be human encounters before. Um, One of the things I was so chuffed about with everybody that joined in the conversation, all the expert activists, artists, curators, educators that kind of took part in this book in conversation with me, was that they gave so generously, both in terms of their ideas, but also in terms of how they felt during those encounters. And I think there was something really kind about that, something really useful about that. And I think what I take away most from museums are the conversations around museums, not necessarily the details and the vast tracts of information. I don't care if that was made in 1850. I do care that it made someone cry. And I think those were the kind of conversations I wanted to have.
Yeah. How difficult was it to choose the actual objects?
Excruciatingly difficult. And I think part of that was not following a narcissistic thread of I know a lot about this piece. I'm just going to stand on my hill and I'm going to shout about it and demonstrate what I know. I deliberately chose works that I'd never encountered or worked with before so I could deep dive into them and explore them. Some of the choices were very rigorous. They felt useful. They felt thematic in following journeys and people. Pieces that connected two different colleagues in two different countries, for example, that it was less so about the piece, more so about the connection that it brought by having that conversation. Some of the pieces, though, were based on pure emotion. Just, wow, this is an incredible object that is so far removed from my lived experience, but gives me so much empathy. Um, it wasn't necessarily about choosing pieces that I liked. It was choosing pieces that were useful, and also people suggesting pieces to me. Some pieces that I'd decided I'd like to start the conversation with this. I've had colleagues turn around to me during the course of the book and turn around and say, like, actually, knowing you, knowing the aim of this book, knowing what you're reacting to, have you considered this piece instead? And I'm like, oh, amazing. Thank you so much. So it was a collaborative decision in some cases. In some cases, the pieces had already decided themselves because I cared so much about them, or they were so pivotal to how I understand my career.
Yeah. I mean, maybe we should say something about the range of objects in case people are thinking you've chosen sort of old master paintings or something. What give a sense of give a sort of flavour. You don't have to list them all, but give a sort of flavour of the kind of things which made it in, and maybe a sense of why.
So the television set at Northern Ireland National Museum's Northern Ireland was an incredible example. It's a 1960s television that is quite damaged and battered, but actually the story behind it is so intrinsic to the lives and the experiences of people in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, and something so domestic and ordinary and gentle by how it looks is such a powerful lightning rod of connectivity and emotion to lives and experiences that many people may have only seen in the media, but
Yeah,
there is a humanism and a personal nature about that was so incredible. I think museums have the power to elevate the ordinary to the extraordinary. But with that, they also have the opportunity, and I would suggest by being in museums, they elevate the danger and the intensity of some of these objects. And I think there's a powerful way of taking something so domestic and having a conversation about something that is so huge. Another one's the Angela Palmer sculpture in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. It's a reimagining of an Egyptian child's mummification and their human remains, but in glass and ink, so that you have on one side the actual human remains and the mummified child, and then next to it you have an artist's reimagining of this, which is painstakingly taken from CT scans of the remains, but instead of seeing the outside through glass and ink, you see inside to the anatomy of this child, and literally the mummy is unbound without unwrapping the child. It's the most incredible, extraordinary intervention for me on museums and their power to see what is recognizable as a standard, sometimes what people would expect within a museum, which is Egyptian mummified remains, next to a piece of contemporary art that asks, challenges, and makes me feel why it's there in the first place, and reintroduces and re-challenges the notion of the humanity of this burial right next to it. Objects like that continue to fascinate and amaze me. One of my favourites as well was the Matt Smith sculpture in National Museums. No, sorry, Liverpool Museum
yeah,
and the Walker Art Gallery. It's an incredible testament to the Marriage Equality Act and Matt reimagining queer joy and pain and resistance in a very ornate 18th century looking sculpture that wouldn't be out of place in a pub or your nan's mantelpiece, but tells a powerful story of equity and queer joy.
yeah, and making visible what has long been invisible in museums, and that's another important theme, isn't it? If people go to museums and don't find themselves in any sense, either in the institution or the artifacts or the presentation, then they're going to feel alienated. So there is this challenge because museums, their collections often originated in the collections of wealthy, mainly men who wanted a particular kind of thing to say a particular thing about them and about their wealth and about, British power in the case of Britain. So there's this not necessarily mismatch with this challenge of how do you enable people to see themselves in a museum given their long history, and that's something I know you're interested in, and you talk about.
I think it's because it really hurts not to see yourself represented on a collection or a stage that purports to be a national story. Whose story on whose terms? And I think communities are revitalizing themselves, and this shift where communities are able to tell their own stories using their own material culture on their own terms within these spaces, I think is absolutely vital to that conversation. But it really hurts not to see yourself included in stories about where you live and where you're from and who you are, or your story is told by somebody else on their terms, and you feel an absence within that. I'm conscious of that within my practice, and I'm conscious of that within these spaces. And I think having and holding space for discourse is vital, because you can't tell a happy story without sadness, and you can't tell a sad story without happiness. There needs to be spaces for duality, there needs to be spaces for joy. And I think the challenge in museums is how to do so, how to do so with integrity, how to do so with elasticity, because whilst we have a shared past, we have many different perceptions of that past and how it feels and how it lands with us. I think these are sites of discord, they're sites of disharmony, there can be sites of disruption, there can be sites of huge warmth, and I would never want to deny anyone the emotions that they feel within these spaces, but they are spaces to come and find yourself, or to be challenged within yourself, or to express yourself. And I think that historically wasn't always an option for us, but it
Yeah,
very much is now. And
yeah,
I think it's one of the things that I embrace with huge relief. But simultaneously, a number of the institutions that serve us are acts of parliament. They are publicly funded. We are stakeholders within these conversations. I think one of the things I'm really conscious of in my practice is reminding people that this isn't a privilege, it's a right in some cases, and that gratitude can only go so far. Actually, we are stakeholders within these spaces. We need to exercise our rights, our identities, our legal standing within these spaces. It's not an act of kindness to see ourselves. We should be able to see ourselves.
yeah. I wondered, you spoke to people from different continents, from very different kinds of institutions, great variety of objects. I wondered, did you feel though that the basic challenge that all these fellow professionals are responding to comes down to the same sort of things, however different the local circumstances might be, or the particular focus of a museum? Do you feel that it sort of boils down to the same fundamental challenge?
I think one of the commonalities is that all of our stories overlap, and our stories can be so much bigger than us. Identity, inclusion, how we operate in spaces. Environmentalism, for example, is something that affects every museum. How do they function and operate? How do they visit other countries? How do they contact other people? How do they bring people in? What's their carbon footprint? How much does it cost to keep these objects in preservation? How much does it cost to stop the roof leaking? They are conversations that are so intrinsically tied to huge meta narratives that are so enormous. They're hard to see the edge of the event horizon of these stories. I think museums are really good in that they focus our attention on the material culture of how we operate and who we are, so that rather than be deluged by a million stories, perhaps we can choose two or three stories that really connect with us and use those as bridging points to connect with other people. But I think you're absolutely right. The challenge is in a society and a world that is moving so quickly, and so much is happening and changing. Our societal movements are amazing and brilliant, but also very challenging. Museums don't follow in the wake of those conversations. Museums are part of those conversations. They're reflective of today. Whilst the objects from the past sit in their own context, they live in our contemporary world. And I think museums are a reflection of where we are, where we could be, where we're going. They're active agents within change rather than immutable forces that just talk about where we were.
John, there are lots more things we could talk about today, but I'm really keen that people should go and discover the book and really get a flavour of the texture of those discussions that you had. You know, things like the virtual museum, electronic museums, restitution, representation, all those sort of things. But I just wanted to end today. You've done a lot of thinking about museums, a lot of visiting museums, a lot of conversations with museums. Can you just pick out some things that really give you hope? That make you think, yeah, this really sort of points to a bright future for museums. Things that maybe that were unexpected, serendipitous, but things that keep you motivated.
Oh, I think all museums for me are contain hope and joy in so many different ways. How they articulate it in backdrops of pain and challenge, I think, is a unique ongoing conversation per institution. But one institution that I'm constantly drawn to in the UK, which I care about so much, is the Museum of Homelessness, which has just opened and is available now as a physical place that you can access, as well as a touring and intellectual piece that kind of pops up within communities. They make active change. They formulate future by collating new heritage and new ideas together. They are active as social agents in change, both in terms of people's lives, but also in terms of legislation. They exist to support, they exist with emotion and purpose. And that purpose is clear and ethical and kind and useful and amplifies voices that are often hidden or misrepresented. When I think about the work that they do in pop-up exhibitions, in streets, in communities, sometimes in people's homes, but then also in founding and housing themselves in the first purpose-made museum for the collection and for what they do as activists, as thinkers, as intellectuals, as agents within the community of care, they inspire me and remind me why it matters so much, why these institutions matter so much, because they have the power to literally change lives.
Thank you very much indeed.